Okay, so, well, firstly, I'm Daryn. That's probably the most important part. And yeah, so this is a presentation kind of showing how we currently write the end-to-end UI automation on product management. And the way we're going to do it is actually by writing a couple of tests for, not for Fulcrum or Product Finder, but for an external site, just to so we don't have to understand any sort of domain knowledge. We'll just, it's just a simple site that we'll probably all know what we expect to see. Okay. So I'm not sure how many people are new to automation and new to page objects. Who is new to this concept? Okay. All right. So just very quickly. So what this diagram tries to represent is that we have a test, and then there's something called a page object, which is a class or an object which represents the page, the actual web page. It encapsulates the behavior of the page, so that when we write the test, we can use a kind of a higher level API or a higher level methods to control what's actually happening in the browser. And we'll see examples of those. And the key thing is, so what we've tried to keep to within this project known as Fulcrum Specs, we don't write any assertions in the page object. So there's no actual tests within the page objects. There's one or two places where we might raise an exception if something is not as we expected, but all actual, expect this to equal that goes in the test. So the test kind of controls the flow and checks that the result matches the expectation. And this is responsible only for the behavior of the page. Okay. So why naked? Mainly because it's a good title to get people into the room. No, so when I joined the team, we had a test framework, and basically I think none of the tests were passing, and it was very difficult to see what it was trying to do, and we kind of stripped out a lot of layers. Probably the most controversial was Cucumber, so we got rid of Cucumber. We got rid of RSpec assertions, which are fancy ways of writing the matches, and we got rid of this thing known as SitePrism, which is basically, SitePrism is there's a handful of third-party frameworks that you can use for writing page objects. And yeah, we stripped that out as well. So we pretty much grew our page objects from scratch. So because we've removed all these layers, that's why I've referred to them as sort of naked page objects. Yeah. So for those people who are new to Capybara, so this is all in Ruby. Capybara is pretty much a library that lets you drive a web page. And it does so by using other components underneath it, like Selenium WebDriver. So you configure Capybara to use one of these other libraries, and then you use the Capybara API to drive the browser. And we'll have a look at some of that. There's another, I know before people have asked how exactly does Capybara fit in. This diagram explains it quite well. So we don't use Cucumber, we use mini-test. So whether you say Cucumber mini-test, it's the same thing. And then within the test, there should be another layer here called page objects, but this is a high-level view. Okay, so we have the test running, which uses Capybara, and in our case, we normally use the Selenium WebDriver. And we also sometimes use Phantom.js, which is a browser, a headless browser. And these tools on the right are the ones that actually drive the site. Okay, and we don't use the middle one. That is only if you're doing Ruby on Rails or Sinatra. Is anybody new to CSS? Yeah. Okay, so we don't have to. I think the only thing I'll point out is this idea of scoping in CSS, where you start with a body, so it scopes it to everything that's in this element, and then it's saying, so this is a way of selecting body.bold. So first come down to body, and then finding something with a class of bold. So it will select this element here, which has got two classes, one of them being bold. Okay. And then if you sort of the way Capybara works is you use CSS selectors to find elements, and then you perform actions on them. So if you just want to find the header one, you do that, then you could say something like .text. And then here is a scoping, one way of scoping. You say within this body, do, and then all the methods that happen here are scoped within that section. Okay, is everybody good? Capybara has there's two ways of interacting with the page. One being the node element, where you use a finder, or this first just, if you've got multiple, first we'll pick the first one, and then perform whatever action you want on it. And then there's a high-level DSL, which does, so this does the same as that. So this will fill in a text box with the ID of name, and it'll give it the value Bob. This one here is quite important. So these two do the same. The difference is when you use this, so this is a node element, and when you call set Bob on here, there's a very slight difference. This one here does not fire off JavaScript events, while this one here does. So if your team is using a lot of sort of on-text change, you want to stick to this one here. Otherwise, it might not. You can test it as you write the test, but there's a chance that this one here might not do it might not behave the same way as when you're manually typing things in. Okay, once again, this is the kind of high-level view, and then so we are using Selenium WebDriver, and if we take a more detailed view, we've got something like this. So I called this the unofficial, you can think of it as the mental model or sort of crazy model. It's up to you how you want to interpret it. But we have tests, page objects, then we stick to the Capybara DSL or API, and that is normally wired up to WebDriver. Sometimes we run it with Phantom.js, but most of the time it's using WebDriver, and WebDriver itself is a high-level API where you can choose if you want to use one of these drivers, either Chrome, IE, Firefox, etc. And there's a whole bunch of them. I think there's an Android driver as well, an iOS driver. And then they use this, each vendor of a browser supplies their own driver. Actually, that's what that is. And that allows, the way WebDriver works is that a vendor of a browser supplies a library which is able to control their browser through their own automation. And the old WebDriver used to inject JavaScript, but this works differently. It uses the proper automation of each browser.
So Chrome's got that Chrome driver.
Exactly, yeah. That is why you would have to, if you want to run your test in Chrome, you have to download the driver and make sure it's on your path, and then it'll start working. Firefox is the easiest to get going with because it has the driver in it by default. You don't have to download something for that. So if you're trying to get started, kick off with Firefox and then start getting your test to run on other browsers. Yeah. But it's quite nice that it uses the browser's automation as opposed to fiddling with the JavaScript. And then finally, finally there's this thing which some developers work on. And if you want to know the difference between Capybara and Selenium WebDriver, the APIs look very similar. With Capybara, you generally inherit, and you inherit the methods, so there's no object to the left. It's more like self.visit or self.find. And then with Selenium WebDriver, you instantiate a browser object, and you would go like browser.get to visit and browser.find by ID. So if you're doing JavaScript, if you're doing Java or C#, and you're using WebDriver, your code will look more like this, probably with a locator there as opposed to just a symbol. But it will be very similar. Yeah. I thought you were going to ask a question in the meantime, you just yawned. Okay, maybe if we get into some code, it'll be better.
Is there a reason you moved away from Cucumber?
Yeah. We felt it was, so Cucumber comes at a cost.
Yeah.
Mainly this problem of having to manage the scope of variables like everything kind of, like you share variables between step definitions, and that those things become basically global scope. And it's much easier if you have just like a sort of an end unit or a unit testing style framework where you have your scope limited to one test. And also, of course, somebody has to write the feature files, and then somebody's meant to read them, and nobody in our team was reading them. So
yeah, if you don't go to BDD, people don't write features or stories, it's pointless. So if you're...
I think it's supposed to be part of kind of like living documentation, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I should be able to look into your automation suite and figure out how your app works.
Okay.
By looking at
So
Cucumber.
no, not necessarily. I mean, yes, that's a good point, but there's more. there is a point. You can write. So with Cucumber, you have the feature files, and people very seldom care about the code. Well, the code underneath can slowly degrade, and people are in a happy state because they're reading the plain English. With this, you can't hide behind plain English. Your testing code has to be readable. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a big.
Readable by who?
By everybody in the team who wants to read this level of specification.
Apart from the, say, BA or product owner who wants to write. So if there isn't a, say, Power of 3 session where you say, okay, I want this new feature with these kind of scenarios, boom, discuss, implement. Instead of you're just being, I just want that done tomorrow. Then mini test would be the problem.
I'm just thinking, is it readable by someone who isn't technical?
Yeah, because a BA and a product owner are not technical, so they wouldn't understand.
So I showed.
It's just saying that's why we chose Cucumber in the first place. So
I think if you're getting value from Cucumber, then keep it. If you're not, then this is an alternative way of doing behavior-driven development. Yep, good times.
For us, we have a similar kind of issue to make a decision to move away from Cucumber as well. It's possibly not want to discuss right now this as well.
No, it's a massive conversation. There's other advantages of using Cucumber.
Okay. I actually showed our product owner one test written in Cucumber and one in Minitest, and I asked her which is more readable to her. Looking at the test level, and she said she doesn't care. But if she had to choose, she was more happy with the Minitest one. Yeah, she just wants it to work, and yeah.
The other thing is that the speed of the test as well is way different.
I can well believe that, but I mean, the example that we're having to deal with this morning is somebody else ran this test. And fair enough, for a technical people, we could stare at it and see why it's failing. But for a non-technical person, it should be anyone in the team should be able to look at it and say.
Well, yeah, in an ideal world, but you also have to think that being Cucumber in plain English, the chances that you end up with something that is totally useless are higher, in my opinion, because we ended up in a situation.
Testers.
Yeah.
So is your tester doing his proper job? Is he using the Cucumber scripts as expected? If that was the case, they were all failing, then to be honest, what's the bloody point of having all these stories that are failing and no one maintaining them? Start fresh, something.
Also, another problem that we had being the scenarios in plain English, there were like same scenario written in different ways, so you end up duplication of stuff. So it's
Okay, but that could happen in any.
The more layers.
That's not Cucumber.
Well, the more layers you add, the higher chance you have, and if you don't get any benefit from Cucumber,
Yeah.
don't see the point.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is just jump a little bit ahead. So I was going to start from a complete, I can still do it. I kind of wanted to start from almost a bare bones testing, an empty test kind of thing. But if we kind of jump forward a little bit, we have a test written, and I can show you So we want to write a quick little test to check this page, the search page, and we want to come in here, type Apple, so that we search for search. Apple.
Well,
I was expecting to see products, yeah, but
Maybe besides that. I'll Google it.
okay. Maybe they sort of change their products or something. You try.
what happens if you choose one of the drop downs?
Oh, yeah, there we go. I just wasn't scrolling down far enough. Okay, so it's the search page which has this text box, and if I just come in here and I say inspect element, boom, 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 and then what we see here is here we go. This is that text box, and it has an ID of Q. So if we go back into the tests, we see here first of all we visit. I can show you. So the test helper is the first thing that runs, and we set the app host of Capybara so it knows that this is the website we are testing. And then inside of the test, when we say visit that, it takes the base URL and adds that to it and goes to that page. And then we say find an element with the ID, so it's got the hash, ID of Q, and set it to Apple. And then we find another element, which is the search button, and we click it. And then what we do here is use some kind of more advanced CSS. Is everybody familiar with that? Yep. I have some slides just in case. I can pop into the slides, yeah. Just this sort of case. So there's two similar things. One is called nth-child and one is called nth-child of. So in this case, we are trying to find the second paragraph. So if we say nth-child 2, that is kind of what we would put inside of our finder. So nth-child 2 means, so it's the second paragraph, so a paragraph that is the second child of its parent. So this is a paragraph, and it is the second, so that's the first child, second child of its parent, and it's a paragraph. Okay, and in this case, this doesn't make any difference. This just says the second paragraph under its parent. The only time it really makes a difference is when you have things like this. So now, if we say p nth-child 2, the second child of the parent is this one, and it's a paragraph. So this one here finds that, whereas this one here is saying the second paragraph of its parent. So it's actually a lot easier to use this one. Normally it does what you expect, because when the page gets big, this gets can get a bit convoluted. Okay. And what we're doing here is finding, and I can show you one little thing that I use. So I'm going to take the CSS, copy it, put it back in here.
CSS Selectors.
Yeah, I have this cool little boinker thing. This in the chat. Here we go. And what I can do is inside here, paste that, and I can see what it's doing, selecting that. And if I took away this, it would select all the items which have that class item box, which happens to be these products. And it includes all the data here. And then if we stick nth-child 1, so now we are limiting ourselves to this area. So that's what that does. It scopes us down to that one box, and then inside there we can say find.price, and that's a way of selecting anything with a class of price. Well, there should only be one thing, but within that area. Okay, makes sense? And then we can get the price and check that it actually matches what we expect. And if we, whoopsie, I think if I run this, it should, and then to run it in mini-test, you can run something like bundle exec rake or rake test, they're the same. Okay, and then we get 2 tests, 0 passing and a bit of output. Okay, and then the problem with this, so we have 2 different tests, one checking the price, one checking the title, and if we don't use page objects, we start seeing duplication of the CSS selectors. Okay, and that's a bit of a problem, especially when you have multiple test classes and then the CSS changes, and then you've got to dig around in all your tests changing them. So that's the main reason we moved to, one of the ways of solving this is with page objects. So I'm just going to skip ahead to another example that is starting to use page objects, which is here. Test. So here we go. We've introduced something called search page, and we can say load on that page, and we can, let's have a look at that class. Okay, so what it has is a constructor which sets its URL to / search. So when we call load, it can use the Capybara method visit, and it gets that through. That's like multiple inheritance in Ruby, a mix-in. And then you can ask it for its search field and its search button. And then in the test, we can say things like search page.searchfield.set and then Apple. And this solves the, okay, we've left the scoping thing alone for now. We will look into that going forward. So the main thing here is that we don't see CSS in the test, as opposed to this test down below. It's still got the CSS. But now we have put that CSS in one place which we can reuse. But the problem with this style of writing page objects, it's actually, look here. So if you read this article, it's pretty good about writing page objects, and somewhere here it says that they should be treated as, the methods on a page object should be like a service. There we go. Page objects offering the services that a page can offer. So if we compare that to what we've got, so this is a login page, and it just says login as and takes a username and password. It's not returning the username text box and the password text box. So one thing we can do to follow that pattern according to that documentation is we can come in here and we can provide a method like this where we simply call search, pass in the text, and it does the job for us. And that way we don't have to, we can just use this instead of these two. Okay, so far so good? Yep, and so we'll jump forward to the next thing. Let's go in here, tests. Okay, so here we are using, we're saying search page, constructing a new one, loading it, then we call search page.search, so we're using the like service level method, search for Apple, and then what this does now, maybe we should go into that. You can see it actually returns results. And in the test it says results.first, so the first one in this array, and then we can get its price. So let's have a look what's going on in there. So if we look at search, it's now returning results. And results is actually this new thing called an item section. So what we've done is this page that we've got, instead of returning one page object which can do everything on this page, we return a class which represents just this box, so the section. And what this long line is basically doing is looping through all of the items which match this, which have the CSS, and then it maps them into an array of new item section objects and passes through this. That is a specific CSS selector for that object. Okay, and we can pop into that. So I've got it here in sections. And we use the constructor, and this is doing one of the checks to make sure that, so we give it some CSS, a CSS locator, and then it just checks that it can actually find itself on the page. If it can't even find itself, then there's a problem. So that's one of the checks. And then there's a method on it called price, which scopes itself to that locator and returns that. And this sort of pattern is what we use quite a lot. So we always break down large pages, and we have a method on it like that, which knows how to find smaller sections, create objects that match them, and return them. And then in the test, we can say something like that, results.first. That is the same as saying like that. Yeah. And that is a very simple mini-test assertion. Make sure that that is equal to that, else give that error message. And in my opinion, this is pretty easy to read. You know, this is given I've loaded that search page, I search for Apple, then the first results price should be that. Yeah. Yep.
But there's only going to be the people who are developing this who have access to this code. So if the board goes red and you're not in, who's going to read that?
But even if you have that cucumber layer on top, you still have to dig underneath to get to the error. Usually, like sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll have an error that's quite obvious. Like, let's say
well, the
13.
good thing about the cucumber thing is you get results set page, which anybody can access.
Yeah, I think with this as well, you can get it.
There's a reporting tool.
And you can see the steps that it took to get to that.
Yeah. So we produce this.
That's all.
We can come in and see, okay, there was a timeout.
See that error, no one's going to pick it up. They're not technical. But that's the same with any automated test.
Okay.
But yeah, stepwise, I think Cucumber's report is quite good.
Yeah, it's just I'm trying to share it with the rest of the team, not just the technical people. So
Yeah,
anybody
that's
wants
a
to
fair point.
pop in and see what's wrong and try and replicate it.
Yeah.
Here we go. So this is one that failed. There we go. So this is for one that fails not due to timeouts, but to actual expectations that weren't met. It says the old ordered log value was not as expected for this thing. Expected that, got that.
That
Yeah.
means nothing to me.
Really?
That means nothing. I have no idea what you're testing at that point.
This thing. Well, you need to be, you know.
The only interested people would have a bit of domain knowledge,
Yeah.
I guess. But the error itself is.
And non-technical people won't look at this, it's more people to fix it, so.
Yeah, this now looks like you can script anyway, but even that sometimes.
Okay, and then what do we have here? So we have a lot of common code that started popping up. For instance, this section here, where we check to make sure that bit of CSS is that we can actually find something that matches this element, and we usually put something in the page as well to make sure that it exists, like the fail, unless we are actually on the correct URL. It just stops these errors, like couldn't find this text box if you know immediately you weren't on the right URL in the first place. It speeds up debugging. So we took a lot of these common elements and we stuck them in sort of base classes and mixins, and what we end up with is something that looks like, so we can the test pretty much looks the same. So new.visit, instead of load, visit is just what we chose. And then the page object looks like this. So it passes its, the base class uses a mixin to store this and make sure that after you visit it, then you are on the right page. It also gives you the visit method. So you just call super that, and then you implement the page-specific methods. And in this case, sections was also extracted to it comes from the parent class. So you can call sections and pass it through the CSS, and it'll make sure it puts the nth-child 1 and build all the necessary classes which match this type. And item section, inherits from the base one. And it makes sure that when you instantiate it, it makes sure that when you instantiate it, it actually exists. And if we come back to this presentation. So the other alternative is if you use SitePrism. So with SitePrism, you can say something like create a page object which inherits from SitePrism page, and then you can say you've got an element with this CSS selector, and then you can say you can instantiate a object of this, and then you can say home.search, and all of these methods you get because you have done that. But I mean, they are nice, but they also break that level of encapsulation, because these are actually exposing Capybara node elements. So on this you would say .text or .set or whatever it is. Yeah. So if you're happy with that, then this is really good. If you're not happy, then, I mean, you can always just decide not to use these from outside of the class, and you add the service level methods. That's another option. And this example we can see with SitePrism, how it looks. I will jump straight into the page object. And here we go. We have elements search field equals, so that's the identifier for the search field. And if we want, we can use it here. .set, .click. That's generating a setter for us, very similar to how we had before over here. It basically builds that for you by default. I would normally, in our framework, we don't use SitePrism, so when we have a situation like this where search field is only being used in one place, we would normally inline this. We wouldn't bother making those.
What's that shortcut key?
This funny thing, Command N. Yeah, and then we could drop all of that. But it's very similar. And then this creates a section similar to how we were before, and names it results. And then the test looks very similar. Load. I don't think it checks though, if you call load, I don't think it checks that it's on the right URL, but it's got a method on it called displayed, so if you want to check, you can. Okay.
What's the problem again with SitePrism? What does it exposes?
It's a good question.
Yes,
Loads
exactly.
of things that you might want, but you might not also want.
Yeah, these things. So, strictly speaking, you should have service level methods.
Okay.
Yeah, but if you use SitePrism, whether you like it or not, this thing is public. So it creates that and makes it public.
Okay.
Yeah, and like I say, you can just make it a rule that you never use them from outside the class, or maybe you're just happy using them outside the class. But I think if you start using these outside of the class, you will start returning maybe a list of objects, or you start having to know the Capybara API in your tests, even if it is just .set and .value and that sort of thing. Yeah. Sometimes you have to use .text, sometimes .value, and it's better to hide that in the page object, in my opinion. But it's also just better to have these higher level. One of the big problems of just using these kind of things is that your tests grow, and also you get a lot more duplication. So for instance, if you take the simple login, where you would say, this will return the username and the password. So you would say home or login.username.set, login.password.set, and then elsewhere in your code you might have to duplicate the same thing. But if they were wrapped in just a login, that would
login as well.
Exactly, yeah. And especially when you start getting into more of a flow, like from one page to the next, yeah, then higher level methods. Otherwise, you end up building another layer, which is more like a service layer, which
on top of this.
Yeah, which helps you then reduce duplication in a different way. Yeah. I've sort of at first I didn't like this thing at all, but I've sort of come around to thinking, okay, it can be quite helpful. Especially if you look at the X tracker test, there's a lot of good page objects in there, which look really, really good. Yeah, but at the end of the day, they're very similar. One you call find, and that gives you a Capybara node element, and here you're just defining it a different way. With Capybara, there's pretty much find, all, and first. That'll get you quite far. So SitePrism, it really does help a lot, but yeah, like we've discussed, it exposes node elements, which I'm not a massive fan of, but I could probably live with that. Sometimes it gets a bit scary, especially when you open up a page and you see like 20 of these things at the top, a mixture of CSS, XPath, and some sections, some elements, some element. Yeah, sometimes you've got to really struggle to see what's actually happening, especially if you're not breaking things up into smaller sections. Also, the way SitePrism works is everything happens when the classes load, so you can't dynamically generate strings. That's a big problem, actually. So it happens outside of a method, and as it loads this class, that will be generated. So you can't, for instance, we'd have a lot of IDs which have a variance ID is appended to it, like a PID appended to it. We couldn't do that. We couldn't use this for that. We would have. Sorry? No, regex is more for the URL, but like set URL or whatever it is. But this is the only way you could do it.
Put a variable in there to choose a specific PID.
No.
Sharing it outside of code. Okay.
No, it happens at load. The best you can do is find all of these things, and then at the time you want that specific one, you do like a each or a select. You find you loop through all of them. Which that is why in our framework they are built into the method. So only when you call the method. So if you wanted to do something dynamic here, you could.
I think you can just do that with SitePrism as well, just put that method in the object itself.
You could use all, but I don't think you can use element. So you would start mixing in sort of classic Capybara with SitePrism syntax.
Okay, yeah. I just meant you could just create a results method.
Yep, you could.
Yeah.
But
that would only be called when you call it.
But the body would be Capybara.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not a. And I think that is what I say. You may still need to use Capybara API or DSL. And like I said before, especially for set, that doesn't fire off JavaScript events, not always. But yeah, it's pretty good. The Shruggy, use it if you want. And that's that.
Where's the code? Can we pull it?
Can we? I haven't checked it in, but I can. Yeah.
Check in somewhere, so we'll have a quick gander.
All right. I can check in everything. The only one that will be a little bit difficult to get running is this one where we actually switch to the inheriting from the framework. I think it's this one here. Because it's not that difficult, but you would have to check out Fulcrum Specs as well. Yeah. I can put the comments in how to achieve that. Yeah.
And you said that Capybara has like these two different interfaces.
Yeah.
Kind of like a high level one and a lower level one that exposes the nodes.
Yeah.
And is there any reason to pick one or the other, or and which one do we use?
I tend to like this one because this one, especially click button, I think that'll look for anything with this ID, this name, or even that text on the button.
Okay.
Yeah. So
So it does.
Shotgun.
Okay.
yeah. And I find
If it's got more than one, would you just click the first one?
more than one it'll probably cause a ambiguous match exception. Then you either change your CSS so you find then you resort back to this, or you scope it first. You can use the using, or you switch to this and use a more fine-grained CSS. And then if you really want, which is probably I think discouraged, is if the one you want is the first in the list, then you can use first. So first, if there's more than one, it'll just pick the first one.
You
Yeah.
could just ask the developer to
Yeah,
write
exactly.
better
Yeah.
code and not name all his
Yeah.
buttons safe.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is why.
I'll
If
say
you're nice. If they're nice.
Yeah.
their programming methods don't really match what we want to do. So I've asked them to try and get to label things properly, but
Yeah.
that's not how
The
they
next step
program.
I've done is like, yeah, if you're not going to change it, I'll bloody change it. Yeah, push, branch, change is a label. Yep, one line code change. And everyone says, no, you're not pushing that in. And then you start tug of war.
Yeah, so only if it's an impossibility, if it's really stopping your work, then you can make them do it. Otherwise, you have to work around what they do.
Yeah, especially if the feature is kind of old and nobody's currently working on it, then it's an interruption to.
There's almost always a way to get to
Yeah, yeah. But if you've got like a 10-line, like a 10-unit CSS thing, then it's not cool. Sometimes it's no option.
How well are you managing to get developers to help you get to these?
Schaffner just wrote well, you're busy writing a test? Oh, yeah, by yourself. And Punch helps a lot.
Yeah, but honestly, I think it's not. Well, I don't want to play the game of blaming other people,
But it's Nelly's fault.
Yeah, it's Nelly's fault. No, in our case, I think it's more a management problem. I think it should be something that has to be imposed from the management.
Has to be.
Like it should be like a philosophy. So
No, I think
either you do that or you do that.
I think we have to wait for management. I'm sure we can.
I think we
Yeah, but
we have a lot of time pressure and other constraints, but I think I'm kind of lucky. Like today, Fabio and I were working together on some intermittent problem, and we were really basically pairing and getting to the bottom of it. And like Nelio wrote this. He made so at one point in the application you can download a PDF, and he made it so that you can use you just lob off a bit of the URL and it produces the same content but in HTML format, and that makes life much easier for me. I don't have to figure out how to start querying a PDF, even though you can do that with Capybara.
So by help, what I actually meant was when they're writing the application that you're testing in
Yeah,
the first place,
yeah.
to label things properly.
Yeah, new features or features that are currently being worked on. I'm sort of well within my rights, and the guys will easily add the identifiers and make life easier for me. I think most of the stuff somehow it's just the really old stuff, like the photography work list. That one I had to really struggle to get, because it's like tables and tables and tables. Yeah, that's a pain in the took us. But I think I'm quite lucky, especially if we are currently working on a feature, and if I say, can you please give that an ID, boom, it gets done. Yeah. And I think it helps if the developers either do it by themselves or pay with me, then they can see the benefit of identifiers. And they can easily see, along CSS, they can understand that's going to be very fragile, and they're more than willing to help. Yeah.
Or threaten them with Falcon Punch.
So I'm not sure if we'll move to SitePrism or not. I don't think it'll be such a pain if we did move, but I think we will see if we grow if we evolve in a bit closer to it, we might just switch to it.
It's always a good option.
Yeah.
It does it all for you.
But we will certainly not use Cucumber or RSpec matches. Yeah.
But it happens, yeah. That's
We'll be
absolutely
looking
fine.
for, we'll be looking for a Java equivalent. Do they do a Java version
Of Minitest.
of that? This SitePrism thing.
Oh, right.
Go to tell.
Yeah. There probably is some kind of framework. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
That's that.
That's right.
Cheers.